that after the Gra was nifter, the Basin of Vilna had to decide what should be printed, what should not be printed, and a lot of people were printing their own versions of the Gra's Torah, which were not necessarily authentic. So they issued a psak that the very first sefer that should be printed is the commentary of the Gra on Sefer Mishlei, which is not his own words. His Talmud, Rav Menachem Mendel of Shklav, wrote it over. So the person pointed out to me, if you look at the Hakdama of Rav Menachem Mendel to the Gra on Mishlei, you actually see it's not only the Beis Din that issued such a psak. The Vilna Gaon himself said he wanted his book on Mishlei to be printed first because of Reishis Chachma Yiras Hashem, that the beginning of all wisdom is Yiras Hashem, and Sefer Mishlei is Yiras Hashem. So that is correct. It happens to be the psak of the Beis Din of Vilna, but it was actually Al Pi the Gra himself. Now, in truth, it's very, very interesting because that reminded me of something else. That Rav Chaim Volozhiner, who was the Gra's Talmud Muvak, issued a virtually identical instruction when he told his sons that the first sefer they should print after he's nifter is the Nefesh HaChaim. Now, Rav Chaim Volozhiner was one of the Gedolei Hador Mamish. Rav Chaim Volozhiner had Chidushim on all of Shas, although we don't have that much of it even survived. He had Sheilas and Tshuvos in the thousands, much of which, again, tragically, did not survive. Things just get destroyed or missing or whatever. But he said he wanted B'davka Nefesh HaChaim to be the thing that was published, because Nefesh HaChaim is in Yonim of Avodas Hashem, in Yonim of Tefillah, etc. So it's very fascinating that indeed he followed the pattern of his own great Rebbe, that the Yonim of Yiras Shamayim should be the first thing that would be published. By the way, this idea that the Beis Din of Vilna was afraid of forgeries, the truth is, it's a real problem. If you look, they have like new anthologies of the Gra's Torah. So Rav David Olayach has a sefer called Peninim Mishulchan Hagra, I think it's called, right? Peninim Mishulchan Hagra, which is on the Parshas, on the Parshios. And then at the end of it, there's a section like 50 pages, very fascinating, called Devarim Hamiyuchasim Lagra She'eno. Now, it's famous, a lot of these are famous things, like famous Divrei Torah that everybody says for hundreds of years in the name of the Gra. Now, sometimes he says we just can't prove it. So that's one section. Then he has another section that says for sure it's not in the name of the Gra. Sometimes he could show us from the Chassam Sofer. Now, it's often from a Gadol, but it's not from the Gra, right? This is what you might call a reverse plagiarism phenomenon. The reverse plagiarism, real plagiarism is if I would say something that the Gra said and I would say it in my name, that would be stam plagiarism. That's Geneva Stas. But there's a reverse plagiarism. Let's assume I have a good word. But if I say it, you're not going to pay attention. So I'll say it, I'll be Taila be'ilan gadol. I'll say, oh, this is from the Gra, so you're going to listen. Right? So that's a reverse plagiarism. And even though a Baal Gaiva wouldn't go in that direction, but if somebody really has Torah that they want to be Makubal, they'll attribute it to another Gadol. So this was a famous mimer of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Shlomo Zalman Auerbach somebody once went over to him and said, "This is awful. Somebody said over a whole shir in his own name, and it's your shir. How could that be?" So he said, "I don't care if they say my Torah in their name. I just want to be very sure they don't say their Torah in my name. I'm much more worried about their using my name to say their Torah than if they take my Torah." And these mix-ups still happen. For example, in Rav Chaim and the Brisker Rav, right? The Brisker Rav, Rav Yitzchak Seif Soloveitchik, was the son of Rav Chaim. And yet, he pointed out, Kama Devar Taimim, the Chidushim of the Brisker Rav are meyuchas to Rav Chaim, and Chidushim of Rav Chaim are meyuchas to the Brisker Rav. So these kinds of mistakes are still made, even today. So that's why the Beis Din of Vilna was very makbid that only authorized people, they were meyached certain people who had the achrayus of preparing the kesavim of the Gra for publication. They didn't want like every person who thinks he has something from the Vilna Gaon should go ahead and print it. Okay, but that's the sefer on Mishlei, which was the very first thing. Now, in the Even Shleima itself, and again, the original Mechaber was Rav Shmuel Malzin, and the second Mechaber who added a lot was his son, the guy Rav Yitzchak Malzin, who was the Shvisa Shabbos other Svarim. So before we even get to Perek Aleph, there is a mavai. There is an introduction. I don't mean the general introduction to the work, but there's actually a mavai to the topics of Even Shlomo. And this actually comes from Rav Shmuel Malton. This was put even in the first edition. And it says, Amar Hamaitzi Lior, Ra'isi lahakdim maimer nichbad misefer Shaarei Kedusha, l'Rav Chaim Vital, Shar Aleph v'Shar Beis Bekitzer, v'hu yiya ner l'raglei hama'ayin, lahavin kama mamorim sasumim, shabo b'sefer hazeh midivrei Rabbeinu Zechreinu Livracha. So, the Gra, right, the teachings of the Gra L'Gabe Midos, they're going to be anthologized, etc., with Makairis, but the Gra assume, right, the Gra is not writing for people who never learned anything. Right? In other words, if a person is an Amoritz Mamish who doesn't know anything, the Gra is already presupposing you have at least a certain measure of knowledge. And therefore, as a result, Rav Shmuel Malton tells us, there are many mamorim sasumim. There are some mamorim that are obscure, that you wouldn't really understand without a background knowledge that the Gra is assuming that you already have. And he's telling, what he found was that through this passage from Rav Chaim Vital's Shar HaKedusha, you will be able to understand some of the mamorim, some of the assumptions behind the mamorim of the Gra. So this is a mavai, an introduction, which is a kitzer. It's not word for word, but it's a kitzer of certain sections from Shaarei Kedusha. Now, just a second about what's that's all about. We know now here. Remember, the Gra lived in the 1700s. The Ariza and Rav Chaim Vital is the 1500s. So you're talking about 200 years earlier. Rav Chaim Vital is known as the Talmud Muvak of the Arizal. But keep in mind, he's not just a Talmud Muvak. He is, in fact, literally the author of Kisvei Ari. It sounds a little oxymoronic. Kisvei Ari means the writings of the Ari. Problem is, the Ari didn't write that much. The Ari Bechlal did not write. A few things he wrote. He wrote, it's interesting that the Ari had a parnasa as a pepper merchant or something. So we do have a ksav yadai on a pepper receipt. That's Kisvei Ari Mamish. And we do have on a small chelik of the Zayar, we have a parish of the words of the Ari Mamish. But B'derech Klal, there's very, very little the Ari wrote. So when we talk about Kisvei Arizal, we're not really talking about what the Ari wrote. We're talking about Rav Chaim Vital, who wrote over the Torah that he heard from the Arizal. And remember, Rav Chaim Vital's whole apprenticeship with the Arizal was only for 2 years. He met the Ari at when Ari was 38. The Ari died at 40. Rav Chaim Vital was a Makobel before he met the Ariza. Rav Chaim Vital was, he was already, in fact, I'm not sure, he might even be older than the Ariza. I'm not sure about that. I have to check the dates. But certainly he was a Makobel, and indeed it's brought down in the histories that when the Arizal came to Tzvat and Rav Chaim Vital was already there, he didn't want to be Makabel Torah from the Ari. He says, "Who's the Ari? A young guy shows up in Tzvat. I mean, I'm supposed to be Mavatal myself," but eventually he was Mavatal himself. And the many, many volumes of Kisvei Ari, different Svarim, are Rav Chaim Vital writing over what he learned from the Arizal, along with Chidushim of his own. But B'derech Klal, in addition to Kisvei Ari, Rav Chaim Vital wrote his own Svarim too. And one of his own Svarim, again, it's based on the Ari's Kabbalah, but one of his own separate Svarim is a sefer called Shaarei Kedusha. Now, Shaarei Kedusha, which you can get, Shaarei Kedusha is an available sefer. It's not, Shaarei Kedusha is, it's hard to know whether you would classify it as mamish a Kabbalah sefer. It's really a Musar sefer that's miyusad on many Kabbalistic ideas, but people can also learn it as a Musar sefer. It's not called Nister, Sheba Nister. It's kind of like Tamar Devira is a good example. Tamar Devira by Rav Moshe Cordovero is also based on Kabbalah, although not the Ari's Kabbalah, the Ramak's Kabbalah of Moshe Cordovero. That's a different system. But Tamar Devira is learned as a sefer of Musar and a sefer of guidance, etc. So Shaarei Kedusha is pretty much the same. Shaarei Kedusha is a Musar sefer. You might call it Kabbalistic Musar. But people can learn it as a Musar sefer. And most of it is accessible. There is a part of Shaarei Kedusha, though, that even the printers don't print. It's something about how to become a Navi, how to get Ruach HaKodesh. So many printers later decided we're mashmit that because that's not for the Hamoinam. So there is a chelik of Nister in Shaarei Kedusha, but that's not even printed. The part that's printed is accessible. So this is a chelik of Shaarei Kedusha, which talks about the formation of Midos and the nature of Torah and mitzvahs. And there are a few important ideas. It's kedai actually to go over it line by line, but I want to just summarize. And indeed, Rav Shmuel Malson is correct. A lot of what the Gra says is miyusad on the yesodus of this part of Shaarei Kedusha. So therefore it is good to kind of know the basic structure here. And he makes the point that, Chazal, everyone knows the famous Chazal at the end of Maseches Makos, that there are 613 mitzvahs that Hashem gave to Moshe Rabbeinu in the Torah. And if you subdivide it, 248 are mitzvos aseh, and 365 are mitzvos leis aseh. That's as of the 613. And the 248 are keneged a varav shel adam. There are 248 bones in the body. And therefore each mitzvah aseh is keneged a bone. And there are 365 sinews or ligaments in the body, and every negative commandment is keneged one of those gidin, right? Ramach evarim shasa gidin. So the first thing that Rav Chaim Vital wants to be masber is what exactly is the significance of the mitzvos aseh keneged evarim and the mitzvos leis aseh keneged the gidim. So he says it works this way. He says the body is not the essence of a person. Right? A person's body is actually called basar adam, the flesh of Adam. Now, if you talk about something as the flesh of Adam, that implies that's not the Adam. The Adam is the neshama, and the body is the flesh that encases the soul. And therefore, the common phrase that Mekubalim use is the guf is a lavush for the neshama, or they sometimes express it the other way. The neshama is mislabeshes. That is a word that's very often used in Kabbalah. Mislabeshes. It is dressed. It is enveloped within the guf. Okay, that's the first thing to understand. That the real you is your neshama. Of course, neshama has many levels, but your soul. Your soul itself has levels, but let's leave that for a moment. Now, I just want to point out this idea that the real you is the neshama seems to make a lot of sense because the real you is your essence is your neshama. I just want to point out that people do raise a kasha. I don't have a great teretz for it, from the lashon of the tefillah. Every morning we say the bracha, Elokai neshama shenasata bi tahorahi. The neshama that you put in me is pure. Who's the me? I mean, if you're going to say the neshama is the me and the guf is only the lavush, then you can't really say Hashem put a neshama in me. It's a little bit of a question, I think. Like, who are you? Who is me? Right? But be it as it may, putting aside the tefillah, which I think is a little bit of a ha'ara, it's clear, Rav Chaim Vital says, the you, the me, is the neshama, which is mislabeshes b'toch haguf. So he then says the following interesting thing. The same way that when a tailor makes a garment, a good tailor at least, the garment is configured according to the body, right? Your arms, your legs, right? It's supposed to match it. So too, the guf matches the neshama. The guf, therefore, the reason why a guf has 248 bones and 365 sinews is because the neshama has 248 Eivorim. Now, in other words, it doesn't mean the neshama has bones. It doesn't have bones, right? There's no bones of the neshama, but the bones represent spiritual forces within the neshama. And when we have physical bones and sinews, that is the levush that is mechaseh, a spiritual koach, which is in the neshama. So, he says the following. When we say, let's take mitzvah saseh first. Every mitzvah saseh is kineged an aver. That doesn't really mean a mitzvah saseh is kineged this bone. Rather, the mitzvah saseh is kineged a chelek of the neshama, of which the bone is a levush. And therefore, the time is like this. Just like a body needs nutrition to stay alive, a soul needs nutrition to stay alive. And the nutrition of the soul, now it's a little different than human nutrition, though. The analogy is not totally exact. Human nutrition, whatever I eat, sustains the whole organism. I eat bread, so that keeps my arm alive, my leg alive, my heart alive, my liver alive. I mean, the food, the digestive system nourishes the body. With spiritual nutrition, it's a little different. Each mitzvah is targeted to give spiritual life to that particular aver. So a mitzvah saseh, now we don't have a list exactly, that's another problem. We say every mitzvah saseh is kineged an aver. Well, so what aver is tefillin? What aver is tzitzis? What aver is kiddush on Shabbos? We don't know. There actually are some svarim that try to match it up, but there's no clear makor for this. But you understand the idea. The idea is that the Ramach mitzvah saseh, each one is nourishing a particular aver of the neshama, not of the guf. If I don't do mitzvah saseh, that doesn't mean I'm going to get arthritis. That doesn't mean my bones are going to be weak or whatever it will be. But it means my spiritual aver that is being covered up by the levush of the guf is going to not have chiyus from Hashem. Now, Kabbalistically, what that means is the following. He says that there is within us, of course, a Yetzer Hara, which is kind of an alternative soul. And when your Eivorim are not getting chiyus from the Kedusha of the Ramach mitzvah saseh, they are getting chiyus from the kayach of Ra that is within you. So let's assume a person didn't put on tefillin. Again, I don't know if I could identify which bones the tefillin covers, but that means the bone is getting its the spiritual bone is getting its nourishment from the sitra achra. And eventually, as a person is mavato more and more mitzvah taseh, more and more of his soul, is being hijacked by these negative spiritual forces. And now you can understand that actually why it's much harder to do tshuva as you go along. When Chazal say aveira gareres aveira, you can understand exactly why that happens. Because more and more of me is being captured by this parasite. And therefore, at some point, it gets harder and harder for me to make decisions to reclaim because I have less of me able to make those decisions. Okay, that's kind of the difficulty. So that is the mean. Now that's the mitzvah saseh keneged the Eivorim. Now what about the shasag gidin? So here he says an interesting thing. Again, I'm not sure, it doesn't totally fit the biology of it. But he seems to define the gidin as like veins and arteries rather than tendons or muscles. Now, in that sense, veins and arteries, these are things that convey, right? Blood goes through in either direction, through the veins and the arteries. So he says, mitzvah saseh, give me the nourishment, and the mitzvah lo saseh create a circulatory system that enables the nourishment to reach my Eivorim. That's how it works. So and that's why it's a negative, meaning to say, if I keep a mitzvah saseh, my gidin are strong. I transgress a mitzvah saseh, my gidin, or a particular gid, becomes impaired and is unable to bring chiyus to a particular Eivorim. Which is interesting according to this, because this creates complication, which again, it's not addressed here, and that is, it's like a blockage, like an artery blockage or something. Transgressing a loisasa creates blockages. But blockages to what? In other words, it seems to me, behechrech, there must be some relationship between mitzvahs, loisasa, and aseh, because if you're looking at the gidin as the circulatory system that brings chiyus to the avarim, and when a gid is blocked, an aver doesn't get chiyus, but that means, in other words, some avarim are going to be fed by some gidin, and some avarim are fed by other gidim. So that means that your aver and a loisasa, that's going to have an impact on the ability of the aver to receive its chiyus in that particular way. Okay, so this is kind of an overall general explanation of Ramach Evarim v'Shasa Gidim, that it doesn't mean it affects your physical Gidin or your physical Evarim. Rather, the physical Gidim, the physical Evarim, are a levush for certain spiritual kochos that have to get their nutrition through certain mitzvos and through certain channels, circulatory channels, that are mechuvin keneged the losasas. Now, just as a general issue, which he does not address, the Meforshim asks the obvious kasha, l'chayra, if the kiyum of my spiritual relationship to Hashem depends on Ramach Evarim Shasa Gidim, there is no Jew in the world that is able to keep all of the 613 mitzvahs, no matter how great a tzaddik they are. Some mitzvahs are for men and not for women, and some mitzvahs are for kaihanim, and many mitzvahs are only bisman beis hamikdash. So what's going to be? Are we crippled? I mean, that's not fair. It's one thing to say something is totally on bechira. If I'm able to do a mitzvah and I don't do it and I suffer, all right, so that's bechira. That's the decision I made. But Hashem to create a world where my kiyum depends on these mitzvahs, and it's impossible for me under any circumstance to do all those mitzvahs, that's a real fairness issue. Hashem created me in a way that I need something that it's not shayach for me to get, no matter what. Right? How do you understand that? So the Meforshim say, some say for other Meshech Chachma say that this is one of the reasons why Talmud Torah is so essential, because Chazal say anyone that learns the parsha of Eilah, ki'ilu makriv Eilah, meaning if I learn about Eilah, it's ki'ilu I brought an Eilah. So what's the pshat? And this applies to everything. Even a mitzvah that I'm not able to be makayim, but by learning its halachas, the light of that mitzvah is machaya, the aver that gets chiyus from that mitzvah's aseh. So Talmud Torah is not only keneged kulam generally, but Talmud Torah is bedafka, the mechanism by which I can fulfill mitzvahs that I otherwise would not be able to fulfill. That's why people sometimes ask, right? Well, the Chavetz Chaim says this. The Chavetz Chaim, people know the Chavetz Chaim, Mishnah Brura, the laws of Lashon Hara, right? So people always look at the Chavetz Chaim is that he was very oriented towards practical issues of halacha and musar that Klal Yisrael had to face. But people are less familiar with the fact that the Chavetz Chaim almost single-handedly brought back Seder Kodashim to Klal Yisrael. The Gemaras of Achim and Nachas, the very difficult Gemaras of Kodashim, had been virtually ignored for hundreds of years. That's why there's so many Gersa problems, etc. People just weren't learning it at all. And the Chavetz Chaim was miyased. He brought back the limud of Kodashim, and he did this in a lot of different ways. Out of his own expense, and Chavetz Chaim was very far from rich, he reprinted some old Svarim on Kodashim, of Gedolei Achreinim, that had been out of print for hundreds of years. He wrote a Rif on Kodashim. The Rif is like one of the Rishonim. The Rif is makatzer, the sugyas of the Gemara, to give you halacha l'maisa. Right, that's what the Rif does. The Rif only wrote on Masechtas that are nogea l'maisa. There's no Rif on Kodashim, for example. The Chavetz Chaim wrote on his own the equivalent of a Rif on Kodashim, together with commentaries, together with Perushim and the like. This is called Likutei Halachas. 3 volumes, Likutei Halachas.
So the Chavetz Chaim was Isaac Mamish and Kodashim, and today, of course, Kodashim is considered to be the most prestigious of limud, right? You go to Brisk, right? You do Kodashim, right? That's kind of the Harvard, Stanford, Yale, Lahavdol, if I can use those mashalim of learning, is Seder Kodashim. Although it's interesting, there's one regular yeshiva that actually has Kodashim as its curriculum. It's very, very unusual, and I know Rav Kanak is against it. He says, you can't do that, you can't do Kodashim too. You do Nachim and Ezekiel. I will not express an opinion on that particular controversy. But the Chalapachas, Kodashim is considered to be the epitome of very high madrega. So in the Hakdama of Likutei Halachas, the Chavetz Chaim says, people ask me, why am I spending my time in writing about Kodashim? It's not Nogea L'maisa. Shouldn't I put my kaichais in things that are Nogea L'maisa? As if the Chavetz Chaim didn't get involved in things in Nogea L'maisa, he wrote the Mishnah Berurah. But okay, people always complain, why are you spending time on Kodashim? It's not Nogea L'maisa. So the Chavetz Chaim gave two terutzim. Both terutzim are good. Teretz number one is, which is not Nogea this, if you're maimin in the coming of Mashiach, and if you say, Afal pi sheyismameya, even if he delays, Im kol zeh achakale b'chol yom sheyava, I believe he will come any day. What do you mean it's not Nogea L'maisa? You don't believe Mashiach can come tomorrow? Oh, tomorrow actually he won't come because Erev Shabbos, but Sunday he can come, Motzei Shabbos, right? You don't believe? It'll be Nogea L'maisa. So the Chavetz Chaim says, if you're Isaac in Seder Kodashim, that shows you're maimin b'bias hagaya. That's teretz number one. But teretz number two is Nogea to what Rav Chaim Vital was saying. He says, b'dafka, because it's not Nogea L'maisa. The only way our neshama can get the chiyus, the special chiyus, whatever the evarim of Kodashim are, to connect us to Hashem, is by learning. In a paradoxical way, it's more important, it's more important to learn those inyanim that are not Nogea L'halacha than those things that are Nogea L'halacha in this element, because the things that are Nogea L'halacha I can get the ohr by doing. But the things that are not Nogea L'halacha, I only get the ohr by learning about it. Now, L'halacha, we actually say, of course, the other way around. It's more important to learn Nogea L'maisa because you have to know what to do. That's a separate issue. But in terms of the need of the light of that parsha, in fact, it's mukhrich this way, because let's take a get. Giving a get is a mitzvah saseh in the Torah. The Torah says if you want to divorce your wife, you're a mechuyev to give a get. It's counted as one of the 613 mitzvahs. Now that must mean, if it's one of the 248 mitzvahs saseh, there's a get bone in my body. There is a bone that does not get, no pun, does not get the shefa unless I do get. So what does that mean? And according to Rav Chaim Vital, that means if I didn't give a get to my wife, that means it's being nourished from the sitra achra and the kaichas of tuma, and it's marchik me from Hashem. So what on earth is a person supposed to do? You come home one night and you say, honey, I know, we have a great marriage, but, listen, I have this get bone and I got to take care of it. Sorry. What, you're supposed to divorce your wife? That sounds crazy, right? The answer is, so you better learn Maseches Gittin. Yeah, Einachinami. You'll get the get bone, so to speak, by learning Maseches Gittin. It's muchrich. The Talmud Torah is the mafteach that gives you this spiritual chiyus. And that's one of the reasons why Talmud Torah is Keneged Kulam. And that's the same thing, therefore, with Kodashim, with Tyrus, with all of the inyanim that we learn, that may not be Nogea L'halacha right away, although we hope, Bezras Hashem, that they should be Nogea with Bias HaGayel, but they're not Nogea L'maisa. So what? For Keret, your neshama is going to get the ohr of the mitzvah by the learning of it. Okay, so that's the first point that Rav Chaim Vital makes about the Ramach Evarim and the Shasagidim. Now, the next point he makes is what is the role of the Midos? What are the role of Midos generally? And he makes an interesting point that in the Ramach Evarim and the Shasagidim, there are not that many mitzvahs that are connected Midos. Right? The Torah tells you to do things, and the Torah tells you not to do things. But the Torah doesn't really tell you not to be angry. The Torah does not tell you explicitly to be kind. It gives you a mitzvah of tzedakah. There are v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. There are some minyanim of midos, but many of the midos tayvais are not concretized as mitzvahs. So he says people make a big mistake and they think that the midos are less important because there's midos Chassidic. In other words, a righteous person will go beyond it, etc. But it's not really part of the Torah itself because it's not in the Ramach Evarim and the Shasagidim. And Rav Chaim Vital says it's exactly the opposite. Midos, so to speak, create the overall, just like, for example, a person's muscles might create the structure that's sustained, right? That's the body is supported. So too, he says, the midos create the structure to allow the evarim of the neshama to receive their chiyus in different ways. Without the structure, the body, the neshama body, simply falls apart, and it's not capable of receiving the light of the mitzvahs. So I do mitzvahs with midos rice. So something gets through, but everything is blocked. All the channels are blocked when you don't have the midos tavas. The midos tavas is a kiyum of the neshama to enable the light of the Torah to permeate, the light of the mitzvahs to permeate, the light of the arterial system, the circulatory system, to bring the nutrition of the mitzvahs. Now, this, I think, is a little different than the Gra, but both things could exist at the same time. In the name of the Gra, we're going to see, I think I mentioned it last week, in which he says the tachlis of the mitzvahs is to bring you to midos tovos. In other words, you do mitzvahs so you will develop midos tovos. This seems to be making a little bit of an opposite point. I need to do midos tovos so that I'm makusher to Hashem through the kayach of the Torah. The kayach of the Torah is not going to nourish me. In other words, my body can't absorb the nutrition, or my soul. My soul cannot absorb the nutrition if there's midos rose. So that's a little different. That's like saying, instead of saying the purpose of the Torah is to develop good midos, the purpose of good midos is that the Torah should connect me to Hashem. Otherwise, it's not going to connect me. Now, the truth is both can be true. But Rav Chaim Vital is clearly looking at the midos as antecedents. So he says like this, he says, just as a building cannot stand without a foundation, the Torah cannot exist within a person without a yesod. And the yesod of the binyan are midos. So the Torah is the building. The Torah is the ladder, switching the metaphor a little bit, that connects me. But the yesod are the midos tovos. So the midos tovos are not nichlal in the Torah because the Torah is the ladder that you don't start climbing until you have that foundation. So the foundation is underground. So too, midos are the underground foundation of Torah and mitzvahs. The Brisker Rav used to say it a slightly different way, more of a pungent way. He says, the Torah was given to human beings, not animals. You don't have good midos, you're an animal, so b'chlal you have no shaychus to Torah. He says, the Torah, good. Yidden, we can talk about all the different things about Torah, but the basic idea, Torah is given to a human. Midos rice, you're not a human, so what's to talk about? So the Brisker said it a little sharper in the way. In fact, Rav Pinterest once told me an interesting little story. I don't remember all the details, but it was about the bread cutter they have, in the kitchen, that thing they can cut bread. So the shaila is, it's non-electric, it's just a manual bread cutter. So were you allowed to use it on Shabbos? Is it an ohr.edu? A lot of times cutting implements, even if they're not malachos, like a cheese grater, are called ohr.edu, and you don't do it on Shabbos. So he asked Rav Elyashiv, are you allowed to use these manual bread cutters on Shabbos? And Rav Pinterest said something about, if you don't use the bread cutter, people are just pulling the challah and ripping the challah and everything else. So he said, Rabbi Yashiv didn't even want to address the shayla. He says, pulling the challah, ripping the challah. He says, what is that? What is that? How can a Ben Torah just like rip bread and thing? He says Rabbi Yashiv was so fixated on like the lack of refinement, the lack of midos, that they didn't even want to address the shayla. It reminds me of another. Somebody once asked him, what bracha do you make on ice cream? A Talmud Chacham asked him. So Rabbi Yashiv said, you eat ice cream? And then he said, you know what he said? A man like you eats ice cream? he didn't even want to answer the shayla, whatever it was. But okay. So sometimes there's something that, in fact, I think what Pinterest told you, Rabbi Yashiv said, this is a pella, really, it's hard to believe, and I can't fully understand. He says, some things are more important than keeping Shabbos, he said. That's what he said. He said, some things are more important than keeping Shabbos. Basic menschlichkeit, basic decency. He said it, b'shem Rabbi Yashiv, such a thing. Okay. So that's the first thing. So then he goes on and says a very interesting idea about the Daled Yesaides. Now this in particular will appear a lot in the Even Shleima. That is, Chazal teach us, and Lahavdil, the Greeks said it as well, that all matter is comprised of a combination of four fundamental matters, so to speak. There is mayim, there is water, there is ophor, there is dirt, there is ruach, there is wind or air, and there is eish, there is fire. Right? These are called the four yesaides, and matter is said to be morkav. Morkav is a combination of these different yesodos. So he points out that these physical yesaides themselves really have a spiritual counterpart, meaning we talk about a yesod of eish. This is really a Platonic idea that, the physical table is a concretization of a spiritual idea of a table that gets nishtalshel into a physicality. So similarly, there is eish, a physical fire that I can touch and I can get burnt, but there's a yesod ha'eish, a spiritual yesod of eish, a yesod of mayim, a yesod of ruach, a yesod of afar. So the Rav Chaim Vital says, just as physical matter is comprised of four yesaides, so too the spiritual matter of the neshama. Maybe matter is not the right language, but the spiritual essence of the neshama is combined with these four yesodos. And he even connects the four yesodos to the four letters of the Shem Havaya. The four yesodos. So he says, the yesodos come in two flavors. They come in a good flavor, in which they come directly from the Shem Havaya, or the yesodos can come through the Sitra Achra, through the Kochos of Tuma, depending on how you live your life and the like. So he says that when you have Midas Rice, that actually means your neshama can no longer be nizain from the Or HaTorah, it's being nizain from the Sitra Achra. And he says that the four yesaides that are constituting your neshama are the shirish of Midos Ros that exist in your neshama. So he says the following. He says that from eish, when the eish is not nishtalshel from the Shem Havaya, when it comes from the Sitra Achra, the Yesoda eish will give rise to anger and gaiva. So anger and gaiva are connected to the Yesod of eish. And you understand that because eish is that which burns. Right, when a person is angry. In fact, one of the words for anger is chema. Chema, right? And what is chema? Chema comes from cham, right? A person's angry, they get hot inside. And gaiva and anger, Rav Chaim Vital says, are very closely connected because one of the reasons I mentioned last week that people get angry is they feel they're entitled to something they didn't get. In other words, you understand this. This is a pretty clear correlation. When there's true anava, the Ramchal says it too, when there's anava, there will usually not be kas. Because an anav is makabel whatever is done to him. He's humble, he's modest. So why would he get angry? Anger is connected to a sense of gaiva, a sense of entitlement. Es kommt mir. Why aren't you giving me the honor, etc. So it's all connected to gaiva, actually three things. Gaiva, kas, and kina. those could be lumped together. Gaiva, Kas, and Kina come from the Yesod Ha'esh. The Yesod HaMayim is Taiva. Water is pleasurable. Water is enjoyable, both in terms of drinking, in terms of swimming, whatever it would be, bathing. So when my neshama is nizain from the negative Yesod HaMayim, that will generate within me taivas. Taiva comes from the Yesod HaMayim. Yesod HaAfar, which is all when I'm getting it from the negatives. The Yesod of the negative Yesod HaAfar is also two things: atzlus, laziness, like you're heavy, like dirt, you're not moving, and atzvus, sadness or depression. Right? Atzlus. The truth is, they're also connected. Besides the fact that, except for they share letters, minus only one difference of letter, but you understand. Everyone understands when a person is depressed, they will be lethargic and unable to move, unable to do things. So the notion of the kevedos, the heaviness of afar, is connected to both atzlus and atzvus. And then finally we have, and this is an interesting typology, the Yesod of ruach is the Yetzer Hara for devarim batelim, misuse of the power of speech by lashon hara and sheker and everything else. Now, this is interesting to me a little bit, that this is counted as a separate midah. In other words, the way he counts it is, Eish is the midah of gaiva, kas, and kina. Mayim is the midah of taiva. Afor is the midah of atzlus and atzvus, which are connected. And ruach is the midah of devarim batelim. But it's interesting to me that you count this as a separate midah. I mean, I would have thought that if I have a problem in speaking lashon hara about people, I might call that a taiva. That's my particular taiva. Some people have a taiva to eat or be bayal and erva. Other people have a taiva of devarim asurim. It's interesting that apparently the Yetzer Hara for devarim b'telim or devarim asurim is legamri, a different type of Yetzer Hara. It doesn't have the same shirish as taiva or gaiva or kina. In fact, I could have connected to kina too. I'm jealous of you, so I want to say lashon hara. So it's interesting that he locates it as a separate inyan. Now, which means that my midas rise come from the daled yesodais that are coming from the sitra achra. Now, let's say a person is keeping the mitzvahs and is being nourished from the spiritual Torah, from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from the Shem Havaya. So then, the daled yesodais give rise to good things, right? There's a positive daled yesodais and a negative daled yesodais. The positivity of Eish is passion and hislavos for Avodas Hashem. Right? Eish, fire. Right? Eish HaTorah. Okay, not to mention our competitor here. No, okay. And the like, right? Eish, right? We're ohr, Eish, right? Same idea. Now, Mayim is tainug, pleasure in Avodas Hashem. Pleasure, geschmack, I enjoy. And this is an important point that the Eglei Tal makes, that some people took an attitude, which the Eglei Tal says is a foolish attitude, that I'm not supposed to enjoy learning because I'm supposed to learn Torah Lishma. If I enjoy learning, what's the pshat? I like doing it. Not Lishma anymore. I'm doing it because I enjoy it. So I should hate it, but I can do it even though I hate it. So says the Eglei Tal, that's a shtus, that's very, very foolish. That fakert, it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu's ratzon that one should get pleasure in learning. And indeed, l'chari, it's mukhrach from Birchas HaTorah every morning. Every morning we ask Hashem, V'harev na Hashem Elokeinu, make it sweet. What's the pshat? If it's not supposed to be sweet, what am I? It's not l'shma. What am I asking for? The answer is that's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants. So Mayim is the taiva of being margish, the mesikas HaTorah. Afar, good afar, is modesty, humility. As it says in Shemona Esrei, V'nafshi ke'afar lakol tiyeh. May I be like dirt that people can trot on. It doesn't bother me. Right, that's good. In other words, that's different than atzvas, right? The atzvas, that I'm garbage and I'm nothing and I'm worthless, that takes a person away from avodah. But if a person has anava, then he knows that he has a role in life. He knows that his avodah is chashuv, but he's not a bal gaiva about it. And then finally, ruach, which is the yesod dibur, is when you use your dibur for Torah, right? So the point is that the four yesodos are the shayrish of midos rise, and they are the shayrish of midos tovos, depending on whether your neshama is getting its yanika from the sitra achra, the other side, or getting its yanika from the shem havaya directly, which in case there'll be the midos tovos. But be it as it may, the ultimate lesson here is that the midos create the foundation of the neshama to be able to be makabel the or HaTorah, and therefore they are not mentioned as separate because they are foundational, meaning they're under the ground. The Torah is above the ground. How do you connect to Hashem? But you can't connect to Hashem without the structure. The midos are the structure of how you connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore, in a sense, he says, the midos are even more important than the Torah itself, because without the midos tovos, none of the Torah can have a kiyum within you to connect you to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, what's fascinating, I'll just end with this, is that this is from Rav Chaim Vital, and the Gra will use this shtickle from Rav Chaim Vital over and over and over again. But it's fascinating that the Gra was a misnagid to Chassidus. We talked a tiny little bit about it last week. But it's interesting that the very first sefer of Chassidus that was printed uses the same shtickle in this week's parsha. It's very, very fascinating. What was the first sefer of Chassidus that was printed? It's a sefer called Toldos Yaakov Yosef. Rav Yaakov Yosef of Palna'a. Of course, he was born in Misnagid. In those days, every Chassid was born in Misnagid because that's when Chassidus started. Was a Talmud of the Baal Shem Tov, and he wrote a sefer on Chumash based on the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. And this was the first sefer of Chassidus that was printed. In fact, the Baal Shem Tov didn't write a sefer, so all those things, when they print Baal Shem Tov ala Torah and everything else, it's largely taken from quotations that he put in his sefer. He quotes the Baal Shem Tov, or at least paraphrases the Baal Shem Tov, more than 500 times. Right? That's actually one of the ways you can make a sefer today. You go back to same thing, Kedusha. A lot of Sfarim are just taken from quotations that are found in other Sfarim, and there's enough there you can make a whole sefer out of it. That's a way of making a sefer. Like the Meshech Chochma on the Haggadah. There's no Meshech Chochma on the Haggadah, but you take all the stuff in Chumash and Yetzias Mitzrayim, so you now have the Meshech Chochma on the Haggadah. So Baal Shem Tov ala Torah is taken from the Toldos Yaakov Yosef. In the Hakdama of the Toldos Yaakov Yosef, listen to this, it's really fascinating. He makes a point, that we have the famous medrash that says, by Kriyas Yamsuf, the Yidden became 4 different groups, right? One group, they panicked. One group says, let us fall into the sea. And another, commit suicide, in other words. Another group said, let us return to Mitzrayim. And a third group said, let us wage war. And a fourth group said, let us appeal to the Umos HaOlam. So says the Toldos Yaakov Yosef in the name of the Baal Shem Tov, that the waters of the Yamsuf are merumaz to the kaichas of Tuma that try to drag a person down and destroy them. And the 4 responses, which are not good, are connected the 4 yesodos that take me away from Hashem. So nipo layam, let's commit suicide by jumping into the water. That means let's become balei taiva, because we'll be machaber ourselves to the water that's going to kill us spiritually. And the one that says let's return to Mitzrayim and be lowly avadim is the aside of afor, that is shiftless and depression and a sense of worthlessness. And the aside that says let us wage war is the eish of machlokas and fighting. And the one that says let us call out to the umais is the kayach of dibor, which could be makulkal in Lashon Hara. So he actually says that the 4 kitim alayam represent the connection to the 4 negative yesaides that can be machriv a person b'rifnim. So this is an interesting point that both the Gra and the Toldos Yaakov Yosef, who was, they would not have agreed on that many things, use the same shtickle from Rav Chaim Vital, Lagabi, the Yesodos of the 4 Midos. Okay, be well and have a good Shabbat.